we're talking about trillions,
right.
Trillions. And we're talking about 10, 15, 20% of GDP, except most of these very large numbers, including the amazing work that is being done by the central banks, is based on, again, liquidity, buying debt, which means somebody has to issue the debt first, and then last but not least, has to be repaid. And it adds to an existing, a key of debt, which then, of course, is taken up by the rating agencies, and the question of whether you have more access or not, etc. And then again, I go back to the question of SMEs, because they are not only hardest hit, but they only have typically 1 month liquidity. I mean, in 1 month, you get about a third of the companies that go out. And if you take about 3 months, that's about half of the companies that would not be able to resist. So you have a very serious question of, when do you go back? How do you go back? How fast do you go back? Certainly, I'm saying no V-shaped recovery. I'm mostly saying U-shaped recovery. And then the question of how short or how long is the bottom part of the U is quite crucial. We have a number of problems that we're going to have to fix. Women and
we can't hear you, Angel.
Oh, there. Okay.
Yeah.
Again, they're, as I said, women, elderly, the young, the children, the indigenous groups, but also the developing countries. What's going to happen in developing countries? Susan, you're an expert. You saw it all. You went through it all. These countries do not have the structures. These countries do not have the capacity. They don't have the financial resources to throw at the problem. So, as I said, not in a very great place at this stage. And any idea of a better post-COVID world, we're going to have to build it. It's not going to happen by itself.
So I have a question. I mean, we'll get to Latin America in a few minutes, but the social, when you talk about small and medium-sized businesses going under, and you talk about unemployment at these levels, this creates a huge social impact globally, and also I think is going to make a complete shift in employment, because everyone that was in the jobs that they were in before will not be going back to the same jobs. What's your view on the social impact and how employment's actually changing or may change?
You are alluding to perhaps the single most consequential result of the crisis, and that is reflects in the numbers of the employed, unemployed, type of employment, etc. It reflects that the focus has to be in the rebuilding process on the skills, because we are finding out every day that we can do without a number of, especially the lower skilled or the unskilled. They were always the most vulnerable, but now this is becoming so obvious. This is becoming, and then other than in the service industry, the hospitality industry, tourism industry, etc. But you are getting I would say you're getting a situation where you're going to have a lot of unemployment and a lot of layoffs. Now, the most important consequence of that, economically, but more important socially and even politically, is that, well, in our case, Latin America, we already had flare-up everywhere before COVID. Now, but they were not only in Latin America. They were in the United States, but they were also in Canada, you had problems. You had problems in there, several countries in Europe. You have this unexpected results of elections in a number of European countries which was this, the minimum, well, let's say the common denominator was people are angry. They are pissed off, they are not happy with the status quo. We were having a second or a third slowdown. We were having trade tensions. That stopped investment because trade tensions cause uncertainty. Uncertainty is the enemy of investment, and investment is the seed of tomorrow's growth. So the trade tension had cost us 1.5% before the crisis, and then COVID struck. So all I'm saying here is that your comment about the employment, unemployment, and then the consequences on the, what I would call the body politics, on societal design and, the societal harmony, are going to be very, very serious, or lack of it, are going to be very serious, because they're going to leave a situation which was already bad, but it's going to leave many greater divides.
That's to me, that's the biggest concern, because we got populist leaders and some populism in the world as a result of what happened in 2008 and 2009. And this is going to be multiples worse than that situation.
And it puts democracy at risk, not just a particular situation. It's not just a country that, may it's, take what happened, and it looks like a light case, guys. Take what happened in the UK. I participated so hard in fighting Brexit, huh? Yeah. And I went there and I gave big speeches. I published a whole book against Brexit and what the consequences of Brexit and everything else, But what happened when the crunch time came? 60% of the youth whose future was at stake as citizens of the world did not go and vote. So the referendum was decided by the people who already had, seen perhaps the best part of their lives go by, and they basically, made a mess of the future of all these young people. Now, of course, we're trying to see how it goes, make it as smooth as possible, as seamless as possible. What can we say? Both the UK as well as every other European country are members of the OECD. So, we're working with it. But that shows you they lost faith in democracy, not in the particular referendum and the particular. They did not think that this was the way to deal with their issues, with my issues, And that's repeated everywhere in so many examples. And this one is going to be very tough on that score.
I agree with that. That's a whole other conversation. So you at the OECD have really been contributing to the global effort of tackling COVID-19. Can you share some of the initiatives that you've taken? Because your leadership, given kind of the lack of leadership of the G20, has been so important.
Well, let me tell you, we created a single entry for all the work that we would do on COVID-related work. Now, of course, why? Because all our committee structures, and we have 150 committees or something like that, that feed our directors with mandates and with the things they got to do. All our committees were, of course, talking about COVID, because so every one of our directors started making some, but then it became like a catharsis. And I can tell you right now, there's something called the OECD/coronavirus digital hub, you will find about 100 policy briefs that have been done by all the services of the OECD. So
wow.
The guys that do taxes, they are doing taxes and the COVID, and they have put together all the 700 or 800 tax measures that all the countries have announced in order to fight the COVID. There's a policy tracker which picks up in real time everything that is happening and everything that everybody's doing, but also the health people, of course, health systems and the COVID. That's a pretty obvious one, but education. Well, 1 billion children that are out of school, many of which are not connected. But those that are connected, they don't have tablets. And those that have tablets and connectivity, they don't have the teachers.
Exactly.
That are trained on remote. That means you're losing 1 billion with a B, children that are not going to complete their course, that are, losing an important part, sometimes 3 months, as long as 3 months, sometimes even more. The ones that are ending their cycles, but that's, on education. But how about the digital? How do you use the digital? So everything, digital and the COVID, education and the COVID, taxes and the COVID, SMEs, hundreds of thousands, as I said, millions of SMEs, in danger, and the COVID, constantly updated, by the way, constantly updated. And then tourism and the COVID. How do you deal with that issue? Employment and the COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So everything we do, we continue to do our usual, all our flagships, and the sausage factory continues. Also, let's say the boutique continues doing its own tailor-made stuff, but there's a whole effort. And it's been an outpouring of enthusiasm and of love, of just passion for the cause and to make a contribution. And that has been very exciting, very important. And as I said, everybody can go in there and just dive in there, and they will, and everything is just 2 months old. So it's all fresh, it's all new. And we're adding all the time. We're adding all the time, day to day. So that's one of the things. We also are talking. I've had 2 full meetings with several ministers of Brazil, one with Slovenia, one with Costa Rica, one with Colombia, and actually today we had one with Gurría. We're going to have with Mexico. We're going to have with Italy. That means we sit all our directors, and then we have all the ministers on the other side, and they make presentations, they ask each other questions, et cetera, and then they do follow-ups. So we're doing this also to put together all the best practices, if you will, to be able to, and then we're constantly talking to the leaders themselves. I had a long conversation with the president of Latvia yesterday in order to see where we could support, and the prime minister of Sweden a couple of weeks ago. So it's this, we're dealing with the different levels of leadership in order to pass on the best practices and, well, the things that seem to have worked better in some of the other countries. It's everything is new, Susan. Everything is so fresh. Everything, we have very little things that we can say this works better, but it looks like it could work better.
No, that's very interesting. And you've touched on so many topics that we don't have time to go into today, such as the increased digital divide from this, because poor children that don't have tablets, that don't know how to use technology, are going to come out of this much worse, and it's going to magnify into the economy. But let's move on to Latin America, which today...
it also magnifies the inequalities.
Absolutely. And the social...
This is the problem. This is the problem.
And that's the long-term implication of the whole thing. That's a different conversation, which maybe I can engage you in at a later date. So Latin America is now the epicenter. Brazil, Mexico, but they have, Latin America, as you know better than anyone, has many fewer resources to be able to address the economic issues. How do you believe some of the major countries are actually handling the crisis? What's your view?
Again, we had a bad 2019. It was flat.
At
Some
best.
countries like mine was slightly negative, 0.1 negative, just it was flat. You had already, countries that had a big problem, like you had Argentina, which then had the political transition, etc. And we had high unemployment and this curse that is informality. About half of the population of the workers, of the working class, are informal. That means, number one, you can't train them, but forget it. Even if you wanted to help them today, you wouldn't know where to send a check. You wouldn't have a name. You wouldn't have an address because they're not registered. They're not in the social security system. They're obviously not paying taxes. And that is another weakness that we have in Latin America. The average tax burden, let's say, tax receipts against GDP is about 34, 35% in the OECD. Now you have examples like, almost 50%, all the way to some of the lowest, Mexico. Now, and I say, because Brazil is more or less on the average of the OECD, so is Argentina, but there are countries like Mexico, which are about half. So this gets you into smaller, and everybody is now virtuous fiscally. If you put the two things together, that forces you to have a small government. Huh? Because, this is and that means that you cut on your health, and you cut on your education, and you cut on your infrastructure, and you cut on everything that is the investment for the future, because you want to be virtuous from the point of view of your public finances. You want to cut your deficits, etc. And at the same time, you have very little revenue.
Right.
So you are caught in a situation where you show very little revenue, small states already. There's the structures of public services are in deficit in general, and then what do you have? Products, commodities, big drop before the crisis, because there was a slowdown.
Mm-hmm.
China was decelerating, let's say, from 6, 7, 6.5, 6, maybe a little lower. But and where do they get their commodities from? Well, they get a lot of them from Latin America, etc. So then remittances. So all these things were, vulnerabilities. Okay, what happened? And then comes the virus. And it's not that the problems have changed. It is that the problems have become much more obvious, much more evident, much more urgent, even, I would say, emergent, because we never had a situation where people could not go out and work.
Absolutely.
And we never had a situation where people had to choose between the virus and hunger. And we know what gets them out first. They will choose to go out and make their daily bread and bring back to the house, where, of course, they cannot isolate.
Right.
They cannot confine themselves. So you have special circumstances which produce a much greater impact in countries, in developing countries in general, not just. Then you have access to markets. Okay, what's happening there? Well, then again, suddenly you see a big jump in the spreads. You see a big jump, a big race to quality, which we always see in these types of, you're an expert. And therefore, the question of access in many cases, now, the sovereign may still have access, hopefully, but it cuts off a lot of the agencies and maybe of the private sector, because in the end, the golden rule of the rating agencies is that the sovereign always has the highest the highest rating, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a number of impacts there, which are the same, but with a sense of urgency, with a sense of dramatic, let's say, exposure that you did not have before because of the COVID.
Well, I mean, you talked about earlier in an earlier comment that countries are increasing their debt to cover their costs. Their fiscal deficits are going to increase dramatically. So look into your crystal ball, which has always kind of worked before. Where does all this end? Does this look like something in the early 90s where even sovereigns have to begin to think about a reprofiling of their debt? What does this look? Does the world inflate out of this problem? I mean, what's in your view? What's your crystal ball tell you, Angel?
You are already having a few sovereigns. In fact, largish and middle-sized sovereigns that may have to restructure their debts. Because among other things, what we have seen in the last few years is that a number of countries which under normal circumstances would never have had access to, for example, bond issues, did. And because the bond market became very democratic in a sense, and also because investors were looking for yield. As interest rates continued to come down and down and down, investors were looking for greater yield. They went to some sovereigns, which were kind of in the middle of the thing. It did not look like you were taking such a big risk. And in the end, these were systemic enough. You counted on the fact that they would always be, supported or rescued somehow, et cetera. What you did not count is for every single country in the world to be hit at the same time and to become vulnerable. And when, we were talking to the head of the IMF not too long ago about normally, you had 2, 3, 4 countries asking for, in the 2008, 2009, you had a few more, but now you have more than 100 countries going for these emergency packages or for these, support packages, et cetera. And, this, regardless of whether there's enough money at the IMF or anywhere else put together, with the World Bank and the regional development banks and the CAF and the IDB in our case of Latin American, the big question really is that you are, let's say, you are now confronted with either, as I said, much higher costs, which were some of the bases that we were thinking about, that we were going to be in such low interest rate scenario for so long that therefore it was worth borrowing the money, And now it happens that suddenly the yields go up. Of course, this is for second investors or third investors or fourth investors of, for secondary market investors, but for new issuance, which the countries will need because they're going to be short. And that is going to be either more expensive or not available. And on the official sources, there are probably not enough resources to cover it all. So it's going to be a tight situation in the markets.
And do you think there'll be a dramatic differentiation between credits? In other words, the better quality credits versus the lower end of the scale?
I think there will be, as usual, I keep saying this, but you are an expert and you've seen it before. You have two types of issues. Overall, you have the cloud. The cloud is hanging over the whole thing, and say, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, whatever it is, once you paint with a very broad brush, but then, of course, there is, for the cognoscenti, such a thing as more, let's say, more differentiation. But that's after you've gone through the first stage, which is the broad brushstrokes, and therefore a greater characterization. Very unfair, by the way, because the reserve situation is different, the total debt situation is different, the cash flow is different, the types of exports are different. You have many cases where it's mostly manufacturing,
right,
where it's mostly connected to the major countries in the world, and in some other cases where it's mostly commodities and mostly to the countries that are having the greatest recessions today. So, but again, the first general notion will not differentiate too much. Then there will be some differentiation, but the problem is that there is a general blockage of access, or at least the price becomes much higher.
Absolutely. So recently, Colombia, Costa Rica have joined the OECD. So now there are 4 countries that are members, including Mexico and Chile. Mexico and Chile are even having terrible challenges during this period. But there are 3 others that are in line, Argentina, Brazil, and Peru. Has COVID changed their ability to quickly come into the OECD because of the conditions in the country? How do you see this?
Well, let me tell you.
Change their path, let's put it that way.
Well, no, but let me just tell you a very specific case of Brazil, which is, by far, the single largest economy in Latin America, and one of the largest countries in the world, 7th to 8th economy in the world, whatever. We have had not only 1 but 2 sessions, and they're not even a member of the ones that I told you. I get all my directors with all their expertise and all their skills and all their depth and all their experience and they put it at the service of the Brazilian ministers who are having the same, the health minister and the education minister and the planning minister and the finance minister, and just you take a look at all the problems that having the minister in charge of infrastructure, the minister in charge of housing, you name it. And Brazil has been brilliant in the sense that they're not waiting for the US to agree with the Europeans as to when they can start the process. They're just cutting the tail end of the process. They know that whatever and whenever they start the process, they will still have to do certain things. So they're doing all those things. They're joining the OECD instruments. They're joining the OECD committees. They're joining the subcommittees, the working groups, etc. They're now family in a way. There were third cousins, now they're second cousins, and they're moving into the kitchen. And that is, I find it extremely smart, because you basically, we're having this, sometimes very difficult to explain why, the president of the United States says 3 times that they want to have Brazil into the OECD, and that happens in Washington, that happens in Brasilia, that happens everywhere. and they meet at the the G20, and they say it again, and then the Secretary of State reaffirms so many times, but it doesn't. In the end, it doesn't have well because it's also mixed with some European countries that also want to join, and there needs to be a discussion, etc. But they're not waiting. Brazil is not waiting.
That's great.
Doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it, and then taking advantage, of the OECD's installed capacity. They are milking the cow. I like to say we're a generous cow full of milk. We love to give it out, and
that's great.
Brazilians are just very good at it.
That's super, because you're adding to. You're creating leadership in a situation where right now, frankly, there isn't very much leadership. So your leadership and the leadership of the OECD is critical. Can I go back to the gap?
And they're reforming. They're reforming, you see.
Yeah.
This is about reform. And, with Peru, it was about reform all the time. Peru has been, in the process of joining it for about 10 years now. And in the meantime, they've done maybe 20, 25, 30 very important reforms. And this is why they continue to have relatively good results. Of course, the pandemic now is a very special situation, but.
Absolutely. So can I go back to the gap between rich and poor? In the last 6 months we're 6 months or 4 months into the crisis, and our view is that the gap between rich and poor is just going to continue to grow. Eventually, we're going to have to be on a path to some form of recovery. And how can we promote inclusive growth as we go onto that path of recovery, Angel? What can countries do to try to create inclusive growth as opposed to just growth at one end of of society? And if you just look in the United States, if you see the gap between rich and poor has dramatically increased over the last 4 months, and in Latin America, it's even worse. How do we avoid just excluding a whole part of society?
It's not that in Latin America it's worse, Susan. Latin America is the most unequal continent or the most unequal region in the world. It's not the poorest, but it's the most unequal.
Yes.
Now, if anything, what we're seeing is a widening of this chasm that exists already, which again, we already talked about this, is ethically wrong, morally wrong, it's economically dysfunctional, it is politically explosive, politically very dangerous. So, in a way, in many countries, the COVID, the confinement, and all this commotion, in a way, stopped some of the protests that were out in the streets and that were complaining, of course, because right now it's not about having a job or not having a job or having a better pay. It's about your life. So the fundamentals took over. But if you think about normality or normalization, 6 months' time, I don't know, in 1 year's time, then you're going to have the tail end of this, of the COVID, the impact, plus, what you had before. Now, you're talking here about up to 20 million more people in poverty. But you're talking about, I'm talking about 20 million more in extreme poverty. Forget about just poverty by itself. But also, I alluded to the fact that when you're talking about middle class, that means 3 months of income away from not being middle class any longer. because it's taken several years to get to the middle class, but it's systematically been the cost of education, the cost of food, the cost of clothing, and the cost of keeping people healthy, and the cost of housing has risen much faster than the revenues of most of the people in the working class. And therefore, you can see the fingernails in the wallpaper. You can see how everybody's clinging to this, but how it is becoming more difficult to stay in the middle class. Now, then let me move to those that are unskilled and that were even before, in below the poverty line, etc. But what is dramatic is that there's relatively little difference between one and the other. This is like what happened with the issuance of credit in the last couple of years, with trillions and trillions of new issuance, just one notch above investment grade. We just needed one systemic shock to bring them below investment grade. And we got it. We got it. So this is what is happening now with the line that divides the middle class and the poverty and the extreme poverty. They're being blurred. They're being compressed because of the impact of the crisis. So you're going to have, now I mentioned some of the difficulties because when you talk about education, you already had these dramatic differences. I mean, when you talk about life expectancy, things that are so basic, well, for the people who are privileged and who are, born with more information and better food and better education, etc., they will have better health. They will live longer, as opposed to those that will not. And just in the same city, in the same, maybe even the same neighborhood, you will have people whose life at birth is marked by the fact that already you are condemned basically to struggle more and to have perhaps a shorter life and more difficult life. These things always existed, but now it's going to be exacerbated. These things are going to become more obvious. They're going to become worse, and they're going to become more difficult to manage, unfortunately. It doesn't mean that we can't deal with it. It's just going to be, it's going to be so difficult to deal with it. And actually, we have to be prepared to deal with it. That we cannot wish for a better post-COVID world. We're going to have to build it.
Thank you very much, Angel. And I'm going to come back at the very end to ask you one question about leadership. But if it's okay with you, I think we'll open it up to some questions. And our first question is from Fernando Iriola from Bank of America. Fernando, can you please unmute your phone and ask the question?
For your time. We are certainly living unprecedented times. My question is related to the public health challenge. I think one of the things that this crisis has certainly made extremely visible, not that the issue was not there, but was probably not as cruel to be perceived by everybody around the world, is the poor state of public health systems and infrastructures around the world, particularly in developing countries. And I think that's an issue that in the short, mid, and long term needs to be addressed, because without good health, every other economic fundamental, becomes incredibly vulnerable. So my question is, do you see governments around the world, and particularly in Latin America, engaging into that conversation from a broader strategic perspective And also, how do you see the challenge of public health systems changing your own organization assessment processes around different stages of developing countries from a cycle perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. Listen, the average expenditure in health to GDP in the OECD is about 9%, maybe moving gradually towards 10%, because as the population ages, the expenditure increases. But, and you have cases like the United States, which is moving almost into the 20% territory. And then you have countries like mine, Mexico, 5.5%, well below. But then in Latin America, the average is even lower. Now, you're talking about percentage of GDP. That means in relative terms. That means it's not. But then imagine that you have these populations that are very widespread because you're in large territories. Typically, our countries are larger than, let's say, Europe. And then what happens? Well, it becomes even more difficult because the question of providing the service, taking it there, etc., the infrastructure that is needed, the use of digital, the staff, the doctors, the nurses, the paramedics, etc., the production of vaccines, the production of just the regular production of medicines and the distribution of medicine, the access of medicine, the access to medicine. In many cases, you have health systems that will receive a patient, but we have some of the highest co-payment for example, medicaments. So for medicines, and you can go bankrupt. If you are a low-income person that gets sick, so you really need to invest in the health systems, and also not with this idea of efficiency or the just-in-time concept. That means that you build it if they come. No, the idea is that you have it ready, and it's been a very dramatic example. You have it ready because it may be necessary. And if you have some spare capacity for a while, well, so be it. It's part of your investment about well-being. But what happened even in the richest countries in the world is that we found ourselves dramatically under-equipped, understaffed, underfunded. And it was, in many cases, you just didn't have enough beds. Forget about ventilators. And you were moving people out of the bed if they were not terminal almost, so that somebody who was, in an even worse shape would come in. This is in the richest countries in the world. You have these very dramatic examples of the under equipment, underfunding, under staffing, et cetera, et cetera. That should teach us a very important lesson. And we in Latin America should also take those lessons. We're suffering it now. We are in the middle. The difference is that it seems to be ebbing in Europe. Hopefully there will not be a second wave. The whole process has been very controlled, very gradual, and the confinement has been much tighter. More, tighter than it was and longer than it was in the US or certainly in Latin America for the reasons we've discussed. But yes, if there is something that we should be doing, just like we always say, we need to invest more in education. Yes, we need to invest more in health. And for that, we need more revenues. And for that, people have to pay taxes. And you have to fight tax evasion. and you have to have, more progressive tax systems in the region, and you have to strengthen your tax administration capacities and competencies and skills, etc. So yes, throw some of the money that you have at the tax system, and they will probably provide a lot of money for the health system. But yes, absolutely a priority. And I think, Fernando, that you will agree that if we needed to prove it, we don't need to prove anything again, because it's now been dramatically proven.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Angel. The next question comes from Isabel Santemalo. Isabel, unmute your phone and ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, Susan, Angel. It's a pleasure to say hello today. And I just wanted to bring a point that has already been mentioned by Susan, and it's the situation of inclusion in Latin America, being the most unequal continent, like you have mentioned. And for decades, we've been addressing this and really have not come very far. But I want to talk about inclusion and governance in the region. That concerns me. We are, more than others, I think, a region of privilege, a region where elites have access to decision-making and they have influence in decision-making. And we know, as we talk about building back better, you've mentioned we need to fund education, we need to fund health. But what about making choices that will help us build back better? For example, instead of building more roads, building bicycle lanes. For example, investing in clean energy, things that produce more jobs, but also contribute to changing the equation. How do you see that this to happen in Latin America, a region where you've already mentioned taxes? We don't pay enough taxes, and there is a constant struggle. And elites have a lot of maneuvering space for pushing governments for decisions that perhaps benefit a few and are not necessarily the decisions that we need to be taking to benefit the majority and break this inequality trap where we have been for the longest time. Thank you.
Well, where are the elements of inequality? Of course, income. Then the result of accumulated income over time is wealth. The stock, one is a flow, the other one is a stock. And it happens that these flows and these stocks of wealth tend to defend themselves better than a simple, steady, and pretty, weak flow of wages especially in our part of the world. But you have also health, access, quality, and the price of it. Education, it's access, quality, and the price of it. Then skills. We always talk about health and education. How about skills? Skills is a combination of everything, all of the above. And it's what will be, defining your capacity to make it or not in the modern world, in the modern, labor markets. The work opportunities are another question. Do you have work opportunities that are the same for everybody? Or do certain groups of the population already have a deficit and a sort of a handicap from the very beginning? Because you can provide the handicap by lower educational access and quality, and then also that is normally associated with lower access to health and lower quality of health. So then you basically continue not only to maintain, but to actually increase these chasms that I mentioned before, that the inequalities just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that is what you see when you are out in the streets and you're asked to pay taxes. And you know that the richest people in town have their taxes someplace in the world where they don't have to pay, or where you are a small and medium enterprise struggling, and you know they caught you. You know they know everything about you. But some of the largest enterprises in the world, including the ones that work in your own country, don't pay taxes, or pay very little taxes, or pay 0.02% taxes. This is what all this. Now, we're trying to make a difference here. Let me say with great pride, today there are tens of millions of bank accounts and their full details and names in the hands of the Turkish, for all the Turks in 100 countries in the world, the Mexicans with all the Mexicans of all the countries in the world, and the Italians, and so on and so forth, that we have exchanged, approximately, it used to be 50 million, now we're maybe in the 60, 70 million bank accounts. And you're talking about trillions of euros worth of these bank accounts. But let me tell you also, today there's nowhere to hide, because you know your name is going to come up on the tax man or woman's desk. And therefore, you know that if you reported the revenue and the origin of the money, etc., you're okay. But if you didn't, you may be invited to have a cup of coffee, or change the color of your uniform for one that is kind of striped. So these things are important. These things are changing. And this is important, Isabel, because they are fundamental to the question of trust. We've talked about education, we've talked about health, we've talked about work opportunities, we've talked about skills. But the biggest deficit, because it's an accumulation of everything else, is on trust. And why is it that 2/3, maybe 70% of the Latin Americans don't trust their governments? Or why do they think, by even more, a higher percentage, that the system is set against them and in favor of the rich and famous, and that it's going to simply accumulate the differences, which unfortunately is the case. So what happens is that the next time you get a chance, you vote for what? If you vote, but you vote for, quote, change. What change? I don't care what change, I'm pissed off with these guys. So whoever promises the most populist, the most, the guy who is promising more, more and more and more, even if it's absolutely impossible to deliver, or it's, arithmetically impossible to pay for it. But you go with it because you are so angry. So in a way, and it's those of us who are privileged who have to be more worried, because there comes a moment, if this social cohesion, if this social articulation breaks up, then of course you will be picking up the pieces for years and years and years to come.
So I'm going to read two questions that we've gotten. The first one is from Andres Jaramillo at Greenberg Traurig. As you know, the UK is negotiating the future relationship with the EU in the middle of this crisis, and the prospect of a successful deal is not very high. What's your view on the situation, and how will it impact the global economy? And the second question that I'm going to read is from Dave Nelson at Cargill. What are the major policy actions governments are likely to take in the near term in response to COVID, or perhaps policies that they might have taken anyway but use the excuse of COVID that will have medium or longer term consequences for global trade in agricultural commodities and products, or for that sector more broadly than just trade?
On Brexit, I would say that it used to be the front page. And now, of course, COVID has taken over the front pages. But it continues to be a fundamental issue for the medium and the long term. We at the OECD, as I said, I personally was very involved in speaking against Brexit. And I was on record, and I went to the London School of Economics. Nick Stern said, come on, we'll give you a bully pulpit, give us your views about the thing. And we fought against Brexit, but then, for the reasons I mentioned, we lost the referendum. And now we're trying to make it work. It's true that it's more difficult because when you can't meet physically, when you can't be nuanced, when everybody is listening to you because you're all one of 100 people connected, and you can't get that guy in the corner, and say, come on, get real, I'm offering you a great deal, and that's as far as I can go, or over a drink in a bar. You can't do this. Then you can't get the deal done, or you will get a very structured, very rigid type of deal. And this is also what is happening. Now, the other thing is, the UK is not going anywhere, and Europe is not going anywhere. They're destined to work together, trade together, invest together, complement each other. And Europe and London is not going to disappear as a source of, financial, because what makes it a financial center of the world is not the buildings, it's the talent. It's the people from all over the world that London has been able to attract. Now, there may be some banks that want to do retail, and then they want to be on the other side of the channel for whatever. But basically, if you're going out in a universal platform, then it doesn't really matter where you are. You basically, what you really need is to have the talent, and that is something which London has been accumulating over time. Now, I know that today Paris is fighting for a bigger chance on finance, and Frankfurt is fighting, and Amsterdam, and and this is fine. Everybody's trying to get a little bit of a piece of the action, but London is still going to be there, and the UK is still going to be there, and the trade with Europe is still going to be there. Except the great paradox is, why is it that we have to get involved in all this simply to get a deal that would be perhaps a little close to what you already had if you hadn't stopped the whole thing, if you hadn't started the whole thing? This is what is the ultimate paradox. But that will, I would say, everybody's trying very hard to get it done. Hopefully, it will then be possible. The stakes are too high. So I'm betting on the deal. Now, what are the countries doing when to talk about trade? If you read today's Financial Times, the front page, it says something about the fact that the United States has written a letter, Secretary of Treasury, announcing to 4 European ministers of finance who had written themselves a letter, France and Spain and Italy and the UK. By the way, UK part of the package, part of the initiative, in order to move on the question of digital taxation. Well, basically, it suggests that it was like an exit from the process. And at the same time, it says that the four are going to write, maybe they've already written to the secretary stating their points. Why? Because what the secretary did, as the press would tell us, is to say, and if, by the way, you try to install a digital services tax, like France had already done and legislated, well, we're going to hit you with a trade sanction. So what do we have here? What do we have in the world, in the system today? A political imperative on behalf of the leaders of the world that they have, for money reasons, for political reasons, for moral and ethical reasons, etc. They have to tax the largest companies in the world, which are coming out even stronger and, with more profits, et cetera, even out of the COVID. That this is an absolutely irrevocable, political imperative. And at the same time, they're being told that if they do, they're going to be hit with trade sanctions. But they already waited 2 years. Then some of them legislated, but they agreed to wait 1 more year with the application of the law. Say, I will not collect the taxes. Okay, then I will refrain from applying the sanctions. This is a negotiation that we got in Biarritz, last year. But now, and then we said, and work at the OECD, work with the OECD, work around the OECD. 137 countries are working with the OECD and around the OECD to find a way. But what are the implications of this dialogue, or whatever it is, of the last few hours, the last couple of days? That the countries may not be able to hold off or hold back on applying the taxes, and that the United States already has announced that they would then be applying trade sanctions, and you will have a repeat. It's like Groundhog Day. You'll have a repeat of the trade tension that cost us 1% or 1.5% of the growth before COVID. And just at the time when we want to recover, when we need it more than ever, solidarity, working together, etc. You may have suddenly another trade war, except now, instead of, China and the United States, or maybe the tension between France and the United States, you now have maybe dozens, perhaps dozens of countries that will go out and say, listen, this is no longer, possible. We can't wait any longer. So, and all this happens a cheval, as it were, with a few months before an election. So all this situation is very complicated. We, on our side, what we're doing is and I just put out an announcement today saying we will continue to work. We will continue to work with 137 members. We will continue for a solution. I hope that it will be possible. But because the last thing we want is that to have more trade tensions in the world today. We've already paid a very, very high price for them.
So we have 10 minutes left on Hell, or a little bit more, 14 minutes left. And I'm going to take two more questions.
I'll be shorter.
Okay. So I'm going to take two more questions, take two questions at a time. And Marcelo Caravaggio de PNB Paribas and Nina Delimon. Marcelo, could you unmute your phone and ask your question, please?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Hell, for your brilliant explanation. My question is about your view on the outlook for the global economy in terms of globalization, or should I say deglobalization, meaning less trade flows, less capital flows, a rethinking of global value chains, nearshoring, and in this less globalized world, what it means for not just Latin America, but emerging markets in general. Are we now up to a new brave world of less globalization?
And Nina?
Hi, thanks, Mr. Gurría. My question is about your views on the G20 DSSI debt relief initiative. I would like to know whether you think, what do you think of it? Do you think that's enough? And what about the potential ratings implications if the private sector is invited to step in? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. You should never blame globalization for the bad policies that countries make, for the bad policies that countries take. Globalization is an inevitable result of a number of things, but it doesn't have a life of its own. It doesn't, impact, because there are such things as better policies or, worse policies or no policies. And when it comes to trade, we were, as I mentioned before, we're already seeing a very bad situation because trade was practically flat in the growth. Normally, trade has to be growing at about double the rate of growth of the world economy. Now, today, that may not be a lot. It's a question of being flat, and you're still double, but normally, if the world was growing at 3% as it was growing before, then you had growth of trade was about 6%, 7%, and it was pulling. Now investment follows, because investment, of course, needs the trade and then generates trade, of course, also. But again, if you have a good trade situation and it's fluent and it's cross borders, etc., people who produce today to sell to the world, not to any particular country, they have global value chains all over the place that are organized. And therefore, they invest globally to produce globally. And frankly, by the way, all this talk about shortening the global value chains, and I think in the end, people are going to establish themselves wherever it's more convenient from the point of view of the cost of production and efficiency. There may be more prudent in terms of diversifying the sources, but not necessarily from cutting from one particular place or the other. But it's trade and investment are going to depend a lot, as well as capital flows. But capital flows are associated with how much investment are you going to put in a particular country, and it's associated with trade. So you basically have a very big stake in keeping these flows. You have a very big stake, because every time you say, well, I'm going to put a big fat tariff on your exports of this or that, and the other guys are going to retaliate, going to put a reciprocal tariff, and then you're going to go one up, and then you go one up, and this upmanship has today resulted in the highest tariffs in decades. It just kind of turned back the clock, and we had made so much progress. And the situation of the WTO, and the appellate court at the WTO, all our remedies, all our situations, all the things we knew, we built over decades and decades are now being questioned or made to some extent, less effective than they used to be. So I would say let's beware. I would say, Marcelo, and I take it that your idea is about the risk that we run. It's very high, and the problem is it's happening. And then, because when you're talking about markets and when you're talking about investments, the mood, the ambiance, is as important as the actual reality on the ground. The expectations are as important. And right now, they're just, they're bad and they're getting worse. So now, Nina, the G20 and the debt. I was on the call, on the G20 leaders call, and then I was in the finance ministers call, actually 2 calls on the G20, and we're preparing for a meeting that should have taken place in Riyadh under Saudi presidency, but that's in July, so it'll be virtual also. And where the question of the initiative on debt. Now, what did we end up with? First, it was about 20 countries. In the end, it got extended to about 73 countries. The question is, these are countries which have the same thing that Susan knows very well that happened to Latin America in the days of the debt crisis in the 80s and the 90s. You had huge current account deficits, and you were paying debt service. And now you're saying, allow me to either reduce the debt or defer the payment of the debt or defer the installments, etc. But at the same time, please provide me with new resources, with fresh resources, because I typically run a current account deficit. But on top of that, right now, because of COVID, tourism is stopped. Services are stopped. Therefore, taxes are stopped. Flights are not happening. As I said, even if you're an oil producer, oil has been at zero or $20. Now maybe it's around $40, and whatever it is. But very low prices of commodities, remittances compromised. Foreign direct investment, the obvious. Of course, it's frozen. Because why do you invest? You invest to produce, to sell. If you don't know if you can sell, or what tariff you're going to be able to sell, or whether you have access or not have access to a particular, then why invest? You basically, if you are a responsible investor, you hold back. Imagine that decision taken millions of times all over the world. The result is, of course, a big pushback. That's before the crisis, and then put the crisis on top, put the COVID crisis on top. So you basically have a situation where good for these 20 and then 73 countries. They happen to be the neediest, the poorest in the world. The problem, is that enough? Is that the end of the story? Unfortunately, no. Because, first of all, we may need a little longer period to provide for a a better feel of the real impact in each of the countries. Right now, it's simply for the water not to move above your nose, to keep it a little below, but you're barely breathing. It's the situation of this combination of debt service and the new money needs. But then the problem is this enough? And then how does it translate? Are you going to be able to pay it then? Do you move the whole payment structure? Do you get 10 years, 15 years time, 5 years grace period, some capitalization of interest? I don't know, something that will give you space to breathe. Or do you actually get, like Latin America came to that conclusion, the IMF came to that conclusion, Treasury, the United States came to that conclusion, that after a while of paying the interest and servicing the debt, the countries couldn't grow, and therefore they needed a debt relief in a more structured, more fundamental way. And this is when the whole of Latin America went into this exercise. Now, it was very successfully, we think about it, because practically every single country was out of the woods there, except one that we currently got into more difficulties. But I have to say, and I speak for my own country, but also for many others in the region, basically, and also for the Philippines, and also for other countries that followed the model, where Susan was one of the leaders of the model. And then they said, no cookie cutter, but effectively there was a cookie cutter because they found it expedient and they found it practical, and they did it with everybody. But what happened? So much so that there was a moment when the Mexicans were helping some of the other countries negotiate their own, we had the banks cartelized their legal defense, and the debtors cartelized their legal defense. So the lawyers were talking to each other with full knowledge of everything that they knew about, and it was very efficient. It worked very well. It actually gave a very good results. But we're not talking about that kind of situation now. Right now, and the word restructuring, the word haircut, the word this is not mentioned. And it's not about that, let's say, at this stage. Now, you asked, the last question that you asked is, what will happen to the ratings when you ask the private sector to chip in? Well, many of these countries are not very worried about ratings. Huh? we have to accept that this is not what keeps them awake at night. Huh? The problem is, again, flow and inflow and outflow and the net. But there may be a need here to go, let's say, deeper into some of the solutions than the relatively short-term cash flow relief that has been produced by the, actually 9-month standstill that was granted to these poorest countries, to the poorest of the countries, and also because the needs are not necessarily related to your level of poverty. In some cases, the needs and the fact that you can't access a market, and that you have to pay the debt, and that you had access before, and therefore you maybe had a bond issue, or a few bond issues, and hundreds of thousands of creditors, et cetera, and that is going to be more difficult because when Susan led a group of a few hundred banks to organize a workout. It was a few hundred banks. When you talk about hundreds of thousands, right, then you basically have a much more complicated life. But when you find out that Zambia would access it to the bond market, then you say, oh, well, you're not talking about Mexico. You're not talking about Argentina. You're not talking about Brazil. You're not talking about, Thailand or Malaysia. You're talking about Zambia. Okay, fine. Maybe it was related to a particular, extraction project or whatever it is. But then when you get hit by COVID, that's something, and everything has to stop because you can't choose to go to work. Then that puts the whole thing in a different light.
So Angel, our time is up. I could comment on that because I think that one of the things that's really interesting is that in the Latin American debt restructurings of the 90s, late 90s, 80s and 90s, we were going from very low ratings or no ratings at all. And the Brady deal was really premised on this idea that countries would return to the market. And here, as you just pointed out, in a sense, we're going exactly in the opposite direction, which is part of what I think makes this, besides the fact that you have bondholders as opposed to banks, makes this incredibly complicated. But that's a different discussion for a different day.
Susan, everything is going in the wrong direction, the different direction, because the crisis of 2008, 2009 started in the financial sector, and then it went to the real sector. Here, we're being hit in the real sector first, which may, the banking system is much better capitalized, much better prepared. You have, more level of safeguards and reserves, etc. But all I'm saying is the size of this thing.
Oh, absolutely.
And it came from left field. It didn't come from a measurable,
absolutely.
Where you can say, okay, you can fix this with 9 billion, you can fix this with 10 billion, and you never know when it stops. This makes it so difficult.
So our time is up. I just want you to know that we have another 8 questions in line. So maybe I can come back to you in another couple months and we can do round 2 of leadership. But if you had to give one piece of advice in one sentence to leaders of the public and private sector right now, what would that be? One sentence.
Cooperation, cooperation, cooperation. Exchange of experiences. And again, 1 + 1 is 3, and 1 + 1 + 1 is 17 or whatever, it's just exponential. So cooperation, mutually reinforcing measures, exchange of experiences, including exchange of the efforts to have a vaccine.
Well, Angel, I want to thank you because this has been just an amazing conversation. You're amazing, and your leadership at the OECD is critical to where we are today and where we're going to go over the next several months and year. So I want to thank you for joining us today. I want to thank my team, Maria, Indira, and everyone that worked on this. And I want to thank your amazing team who worked on this as well. This has been so insightful, and I wish you all the luck in the world as you move forward. And thank you, all of you in the audience, for joining our first Bravo Leadership Conversation. I wish you all and your families to be healthy and safe during this very challenging times. And Angel, I hope you and your family are well and safe. And I wish you all the best and good luck, and I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and bravo, bravo, bravo.
Bravo, bravo, bravo.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.